There's a function called count and also a companion function called count_a, and both are valuable, but there can be some confusion that arises when we contrast that with what we see in the status bar. For example, if we click column D here, the information at the bottom of the screen, which might include all or some of these, and remember, you can right-click here and adjust which of these statistical measures appear, we see a count of 93, and that means there are 93 entries in column D that contain text of any kind. You'll also see the entry here, numerical count 92, meaning 92 of the cells have numbers. And so the top entry, of course, is the difference of 1. And we see that when we click column D. We see those two entries. So we get used to the idea here that count means what? Counting cells that have data. And so if we were about to use a function and we did a quick look at our list of functions, we might go to the Formulas tab, maybe go to Math and Trig. Where do we find these? Count and COUNTIF. It's not there. Where is it likely to be? We've got some other functions out here, more functions. How about statistical? And there we've got a count, counts the number of cells in a range that contain numbers. count_a counts the number of cells in a range that are not empty. Different way of saying it. If we didn't know any better, we'd say, well, let's do a count. How many entries in column D, or a different way of saying it, how many of our people had sales over the last 14 days? Let's do a count. Count here means count numbers. So if we click column D and press enter, 92 of these have numbers. Now, if we select column D and we see count at the bottom, the 93 there means count the number of cells that have data. That's where the confusion might arise. I think if you try to not make it confusing, and I'm trying not to, when we use count this way, it's counting cells that have values in them, numerical entries. And if we use count_a, that's the same as saying how many of the cells here are not empty, or a different way of saying it, how many of the cells have any content whatsoever. So count and count_a both have a role to play, and depending upon the kind of data we're looking at here, they're valuable in tabulating information. Recognize something else here. If this data is centered, and I wouldn't say that's a good idea, although it's not horrible in this example, but if the data were centered, and if somewhere in the list here, and let's actually do this, notice that with values, you can't center them unless you use, for example, a format like general format. It does allow you to center them. I just press Control-Shift-tilde to get there. So this is general format. What if one of these in here was an L, which looks like a 1, unless you have other 1s around. Now, if you see another 1 out here, you recognize the difference for sure. But now recognize what we've done here. And occasionally you might use the count function to find oddities like what we've seen here. This is truly accurate. It's saying that 91 cells have values in them. And of course, that is not a value. That's the letter L. You run into the same issue with a capital I too. Capital I looks just like a lowercase l. And normally you don't see those, of course, in numerical columns, but you might occasionally. Again, using the count function to count values, using count_a to count the number of cells that have entries, or those that are not blank, are both valuable, but recognize that when we are using the status bar, we have to think that count means something a little different there. Take that into account, pardon the pun, in using these capabilities.